I'm Alex Budak. I'm a social entrepreneur, a faculty member at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, and the author of the new book, Becoming a Changemaker. Today on the show, we discuss finding your natural curiosity to help you question the status quo, how microleadership is the antidote to both micromanagement and complacency, and why being a changemaker sometimes means having the courage to quit when things aren't working. Stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of Leadership Excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. I think you'd agree that we are living in, to say the least, turbulent times. Politically and business leadership has faced some of its greatest challenges probably since World War II. However, one of the biggest changes that has taken place is the democratization of opinion. What I mean by that is that everybody now has a voice. Now, you could argue the merits of the fact that every man and every woman can now find a platform to scream about things that you don't care about. However, the upside of that is that you also now have the ability to have your voice heard. And with the right strategies, that means that you can be a change maker. The question is how each of us can become a real and meaningful change maker. Well, that's the road we're going down on the next 2 episodes with our special guest. As always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please do us a favor, going over to wherever it is you tune into the podcast from, could be anywhere, iTunes, Google, doesn't matter. But do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It really does help. And when you put your reviews and when you do those subscriptions, we really appreciate it. In fact, it's the only way we really know that you're really enjoying it. So we appreciate that. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And of course, we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's dive right in. It's easy to say someone should fix this. It's more challenging to, of course, ask ourselves, how can each of us lead positive changes from where we are? We often think about changes being this massive or overwhelming thing that only people like Gandhi or Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or Martin Luther King can do. But what if the changes that you want to see can be broken down into meaningful, actionable, bite-sized pieces that you could do? Well, that's where we're going with our guest in the next 2 episodes. And our guest is Alex Budak. And Alex is a social entrepreneur, faculty member at Berkeley Haas, and the author of Becoming a Changemaker. He teaches, speaks, writes, and helps people make positive impact in their lives, their careers, their communities, and societies. As a social entrepreneur, he co-founded StartSomeGood.com. He ran Sweden's most prominent social innovation incubator, Reach for Change, and helped Change.org scale globally. So the lad knows a little bit about being a change maker. He's given talks on leadership and entrepreneurship and change making around the world. He's gone from Cambodia to the Ukraine to the Arctic Circle to UN agencies. He spoke for some of the top leading companies in the world, and he's even done it for the White House. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and help me to welcome the change maker himself, Alex Budak. The crowd goes wild, young man.
Hey, Dov. Thank you so much for having me.
So looking forward to it. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you on here. You've done some pretty amazing things, mate. I mean, you know, doing your work in working with the White House, the UN agencies going around the world, the bloody Arctic Circle. I mean, who are you talking to there? Penguins? I have no idea. But all of that's got to be driven by something. And, it's the question I ask everybody, because I think it's one of the things we've societally lost touch with, which is, what is the origin story of what gives your life meaning?
I love that question. I love starting that way. And I should
Thank
say
you.
that I think when we think about meaning, we wear multiple hats. And so if you ask me now, at this point in my life, a lot of my meaning comes from being a dad. We've got a 2-year-old at home, and being a husband. But if we go back to sort of the origin story, at my core, I've always wanted to lead change in some way. But perhaps like many of your listeners, didn't really know how to get started. I grew up in the Silicon Valley, Bay Area. So entrepreneurship was always kind of in the ethos, but for whatever reason, I was just never inspired to start a company just for the kind of financial side of things. Not that there's anything wrong with that, just isn't what motivated me.
Right.
Went out to graduate school to study public policy. And I think within the first maybe 24, 48 hours, I started realizing, okay, maybe I do have kind of an entrepreneurial streak in me from growing up in the Bay Area. And I met amazing colleagues, but so many of them wanted to create change through big institutions. And again, nothing wrong with that. The World Bank, IMF, lots of power behind them. But that's not exactly how I thought. So I took a little time off between my first and second year of graduate school and spent some time living and working in India. I was in Ahmedabad, India, in Gujarat. And while there, I did some volunteer work. And so I was working with a group that worked with girls from the local community and used sport as a tool to teach healthy habits and leadership development. And I don't want to overstate what I did. I was not an important volunteer by any means. But while I was there, I started realizing that change doesn't just come from the big institutions. It also comes from people just like this Ahmedabad Girls Sports Club, these grassroots entrepreneurs, innovators, and as I would come to call them, change makers, who are leading change from where they are. And so that was a transformational summer for me, because I would spend my days working with them. And then as the sun would dip below the horizon, I would meander my way back to where I was staying and, wandering across these noisy, chaotic streets. But my mind would wander. I just kept thinking about, look, there's these change makers all around the world, people who want to make a difference, but just too many barriers getting in the way. And so that became the red thread, which has really connected all of the work that I do, all of the meaning that I try to make. It all goes back to thinking that there's people just like that Ahmedabad Girls Sports Club, and how can we help more of them find their voice and their agency to lead change?
So it's interesting, because I can see how, you say, well, I wasn't an important volunteer. And I don't think that you need to be an important volunteer. It's just to absorb the milieu, the of being in that environment, But what I'm interested in is, okay, you got that meaning from there, but to go there, like to drop out between year 1 and year 2 and go off to India, what's the impetus there? Because, that's, where you're from Silicon Valley. Well, okay, you've got a little bit of hippy dippy in that area previous to Silicon Valley. But why India? What was that pull? Because that's a very spiritual place for a lot of people. It's got a different pull.
I've always had a streak of sort of questioning the status quo and trying to challenge some of my biases, my assumptions. When I was an undergraduate, I went out to Washington, D.C. for a quarter. And while there, you sort of do a research paper and you do an internship. And I think everyone who's ever done the program goes and interns with an organization that has their same political beliefs. I decided this is a chance for me to challenge some of my beliefs. And so I actually went and I interned with an organization that had sort of divergent views from mine, just so I could say, hey, look, I'm going to try to learn as much as I can, work on it, and see if, my perspective changes. So I've always had that sort of mindset into things. And so when it came time to choose what I would do, I was looking at a few different places. I knew I wanted to get outside of the US. And one of the options that I loved was going to Berlin. I had lived in Berlin for a little bit, one of my favorite cities in the world. I speak some German, albeit not very good German. And if my German teacher is listening, ein bisschen, my grammar is horrendous. I just sort of can, make by with enough vocabulary. But that felt adventurous in one way, but also quite safe because I knew the language, I knew the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, what a great chance for me to go someplace that was very different. And exactly what you said, it's a spiritual place. It's a place completely different from what I was used to. And that's really what drew me to decide, yeah, let's go do it.
But even prior to that is this piece about, going into university and looking at policy making and those kinds of things. So what's that? Because like I'm imagining this kid, and I want to sort of get to that kid right now. I'm imagining this kid, like, what is that thought? And I know, I'll just give you me. When I can remember being 9 years old, maybe almost 10, looking at my aunt dating, like my aunt was very good looking and dating these guys who she all thought were Prince Charming, who I at 9 years old could work out, these are losers. Right. And thinking, why does this smart person do the same dumb things? Right. And it became the driving question of my life, right? Which is, why do people do what they do, even when what they do doesn't make sense, even to them? Because they do realize later. What was that for you? Because it seems like there was something there, Alex, that we've not sort of pulled the thread on yet.
Yeah. So you had a guest on previously, an amazing social entrepreneur, Gil Winch, and love that interview. And he talked about when he was a kid that when he would watch a movie that had like an animal that would die, he would step out of the room. He couldn't handle it. Right. And so I think for me, I had a little bit of that. I actually resonated with that because I did the same thing as a kid. But the sort of like beating heart of everything I do is this lens of inclusivity, this idea that people have so much more power and potential than we realize. I've always been inspired by this idea that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And I feel very fortunate that I had a lot of opportunity growing up. And I've always felt like, well, if I have this, I have skill, I work hard, but there's also a lot of luck. And so I think recognizing the great luck that I had and saying, well, there's an opportunity there to do something with that. And that's been a streak ever since I was a kid, even as a kid in middle school and high school, which is, those awkward years. I had a close group of friends, a few friends, but also I was kind of friends with everyone. Like I liked spending a little time with all the different groups. And I thought that that's how life should be. It's not just about sort of building your own little bubble, but seeing the potential and the opportunity and what others can teach you. And so that's always been sort of the way I walk throughout the world, I think.
It's very interesting because I think that if you grow up as a whitey in whitey town, surrounded by whitey, you either only see that and you think, well, this is how life is, or you go, is this it? Is everybody whitewashed? And you suddenly have this pull towards the outer world and like to looking at other people and other groups, and so I think that's also a natural pull in us, which is it's either we're inside of our fence or we're outside of it. And it's interesting because you used a term that is I describe myself as, which is when somebody breaches my bias, I'm delighted. Like people are always like shocked by that. I'm like, oh, you just showed me a bias. Tell me more. I'm excited because I thought it was absolutely right. And now you broke that. And it's not common to hear that, Alex. So I really want you to know that I appreciate that. And to me, it seems that, this whole focus around being a change maker and assisting change making requires that in a way that maybe most people would never think about. So I really want you to know, I appreciate that, particularly in the movement of what it is you've done. So let's sort of take that to the next level because you describe yourself as a social entrepreneur. Now let's pretend that people don't know what a social entrepreneur is because we know that in America, the worst curse word you can use is social because it goes with socialist. And it's not necessarily that. So what is a social entrepreneur? What does that mean? So that our listeners can really grasp where you're coming from.
The best way to think about it, it's someone who uses the tools of entrepreneurship, but to solve a social challenge. And oftentimes that means that profit and purpose go hand in hand. Could be a for-profit company, could be a nonprofit company, but I look at less as the outcome and more about the approach. It's instead of saying, look, there's a problem, let's just keep throwing money at it, kind of think in a charity mindset, but instead think about, my definition is using the tools of entrepreneurship to fundamentally solve a social challenge. The best social entrepreneurs I know, and this is where they differentiate from traditional entrepreneurs, is they want to put themselves out of business. So if you're trying to work on a problem, you solve that problem, boom, you're done. Now move on to something else. It's not to create an organization in perpetuity. It's really to solve a problem. And so
that's a very, say that again, because I want everybody to get that, that it's about putting yourself out of work. Say that again, because that's profound.
Yeah. So the best social entrepreneurs will try to put themselves out of business. It's a counterintuitive way to think, because most entrepreneurs say, look, I've got a recurring revenue stream. This is great. I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to ride this. But a social entrepreneur, their success is a problem is solved and they're no longer needed.
Oh, yeah. So it's very interesting. I mean, it's a very interesting because it seems, as you said, it seems like a dichotomy, that part of you that's very entrepreneurial and the part of you that wants to make the changes. And, that's kind of like the devil and the Satan inside of you pulling at either side. But you've found this way to bring the two together in a way that is profound. So let's talk about that, because you've got this social entrepreneur side, which, the entrepreneurial is profitable. But at the same time, you are still a teacher. You're still a professor at Berkeley. So what motivates you or inspires you to remain in that world, which is kind of being a professor at a university is kind of controversial these days, which is bizarre for me, but is a controversial place these days. How do what inspires you and motivates you in the context of that, while there is this very active entrepreneurial side of you?
One of the things that I learned is that there's a difference between an entrepreneur and thinking entrepreneurially.
Oh,
and
okay.
So while I've created ventures, that's traditional entrepreneurship, I bring this lens of thinking and acting like an entrepreneur into everything that I do. So when I joined Berkeley Haas, I'm not a traditional professor. I don't have a PhD. I came in through sort of the practice route. And I had a quite serendipitous meeting. So I was meeting with the head of curriculum. His name is Jay Stowski, and he kind of oversees all the faculty, all the classes being offered. And I went to him just asking him for some career advice on a sort of transition I was thinking about making. And I think within a couple of minutes, he could tell my heart wasn't really in it. And so I'll never forget the words he said. He said, Alex, what do you really want to do? I said, well, what I really want to do is teach. And I kind of assumed that he would say no. And I started making excuses for all the reasons I couldn't teach. But he interrupted me and said, okay, Alex, what do you want to teach? And in that moment, it became crystal clear for me. I said, I want to teach a class called Becoming a Changemaker. And again, to my shock and delight, he said, okay, put together a syllabus, show it to me, and we'll go from there. And so I remember just absolutely leaping out of my seat. I shook his hand, walked out of his office, closed the door, and then pulled out my phone and Googled how to create a syllabus, because I had no idea what I was doing.
Did you go, what is a syllabus?
But that's where sort of the entrepreneur streak comes in.
Right.
Because I said, look, I don't know how to actually teach. I have some intuition. I love teaching, love mentoring. I haven't actually taught before, but let's figure it out. And so I think I've brought that entrepreneurial lens to my teaching, even though you might think that a professor is not a very entrepreneurial career.
Right. That's very, very cool. So you say that each of us can become a change maker. But as I said in the beginning, I think a lot of people will have the excuse that I'm not enough, I'm not big enough. And, we can poke holes in that until the sun dies out. But I think there's a bigger challenge, which is up front, which is there's a lot of moaning and complaining about the things that should be changed. But if you push someone and you ask them what do they want specifically, the research is pretty clear that most people don't know what they want. In order for things, we want Congress to do better. Okay, that's vague. People don't really know what they want. So, or they want change that's not, I'll have one of my favorite sayings I talk about in my workshops is everybody wants change as long as they don't have to. So in other words, it's not inconvenient for me, right? So with that in mind, what do you mean when you say that each of us can become a change maker?
So I see where you're coming from. Absolutely. And a lot of the work that I do is to help change makers find their own sense of agency. Now, I've always loved the speech from Theodore Roosevelt about the man in the arena, which is about saying it's not the critic who counts. It's very easy to be a critic. It's very easy to point out all the things that could be better. But it's another thing to actually roll up your sleeves and say, like, let me jump in. Mm-hmm. So in my classes and in the book, I quote singer-songwriter Joan Baez. So she says, action is the antidote to despair. And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it, because if you look at the world today, whether it's through the lens of politics or culture or technology or economics, there's all too many reasons to feel a sense of despair. But I like the way she frames it, which is that, can you have a bias towards action? So can you say, yeah, this is something bad, and we can actually find some agency in taking some action? But again, easier said than done. I get it. Worked with change makers all around the world. And I found that even the most successful change makers, so the social entrepreneurs, even the people at Fortune 500 companies, the folks that listen to your podcast, get really overwhelmed with change, both the sheer number of changes that are necessary, as well as like even knowing how to get started. What Pfeffer and Sutton sometimes call the knowing doing gap. And so that's what I spent a lot of my career looking at, is how can we break change down and make it so that it's something that actually feels achievable, that people can figure out, look, I don't know all the steps, but I can at least have the confidence to take that first step.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we pass off the knowing doing gap as laziness, and I don't know that that's actually the answer. But as we said earlier, I think that people think that it's bigger than me and I don't know what to do. And your book lays out how to get into the sort of bite-sized pieces of that, because I think that any change we look at can easily seem too big. The the person who's in a bad marriage, and you say, well, okay, well, what do you need to fix? It's too big. Well, let me ask you, if you sat and listened to your partner for 1 minute every day, just 1 minute, would that make a difference? Well, I don't think so. Well, why don't we just try that? Just 1 minute. And it's like, oh yeah, well, okay, well, because I think that we see these challenges are so big, and at the same time, and this is why I wanted to bring this up with you, is we're living in this time of enormous change. I mean, we got now, it's been around for a while, but it's birthed into the public, which is AI, and like, oh my God, my job's going away. Well, Ray Kurzweil talked about 40% of the jobs going away. Was it 10 years ago or maybe more? All those kinds of things have been right on the surface, but we all love to deny the change until it's punched us in the nose. So in the book, you lay this out. Because I just want to start here. Where do we start? So a person is looking at something that bothers them, which I talked about even in my interview with Gil, is we look at things that bothers us and we just don't think about how we might change it. It just seems too big. What you lay it out. So walk us through simple steps to just start us off.
Okay, so let's start with the framework. I think there's 3 parts of being a change maker. There's your mindset, your leadership, and then your action. So we need all 3. So mindset, that's a way of seeing the world and your role in shaping it. And so here I've done some research that actually looks at, what do the most effective change makers have in common? And we can break apart some of these things, but it's concepts like resilience and curiosity and flexibility. That's your way of sort of how you show up in the world. Okay, so you've got your mindset, but then we start building on it. Think of that as like the base floor of the pyramid. Move the next step up. And that's leadership. And that's how do you do your best work through and with others? I always say that change making is a team sport. And though we tend to overglorify the one individual, it really takes all of us, and no meaningful change will be done by ourselves. And so how do you enroll others in the change? And a lot of what I focus on here is how do you influence without authority? And also a new concept maybe we'll talk about called micro leadership, which breaks leadership down to be much more accessible to each of us.
And I do want to talk about that as a separate subject, because I think that's very important, because it's easy to mix up with micromanagement.
Yep.
And that's definitely not what you're talking about.
Yeah, we'll talk about the antidote.
So we've got the mindset, we've got the leadership, and then we've got the action. So in the mindset level, resilience is obvious. If you're going to be a change maker, because you're going to be confronted with disappointment, you're going to be confronted with, all kinds of obstacles. So resilience, obviously. And because it's right above my shoulder, that my religion is curiosity. Talk to us about why you believe that's important, because I think that it's kind of like we've got this dopamine hit thing going on where we think we're curious because we're pursuing the next dopamine hit, but that's not curiosity. Tell us why you think curiosity is so important in being a change maker and what you see curiosity as.
Yeah. So in the book, I tell the story of an engineer named Lila Olgren. And I would bet that nearly none of your listeners will know her, but nearly all of us will have benefited from her work. So she worked with the Swedish telecommunications agency back in the 1970s, and she was on the team trying to develop the first ever mobile phone. And what they were trying to do is basically take the same experience of the landline, right? So picking up a phone in your office, your home, and just convert it, in this case, into an automobile. And so they took that same model, applied it to the car, and they kept running into the same issue. You start dialing a number, you try to dial, it would go to the phone tower, but a shadow would get in the way, a tree would get in the way, a tunnel would get in the way, and it would kept dropping. And so, again, this sounds quaint at this point, but imagine 1970s, we've never figured out this technology.
No.
And so they just keep doing
this. This is before the brick, ladies and gentlemen. This is before the brick. And if you're young, you don't know what the brick is, but the brick is a cell phone that was the size of a brick that you needed a mobile generator for.
Exactly, that huge thing. So they kept trying to recreate that exact same model. But Lila Olgren finally said, well, that doesn't make sense. She sort of dialed up her curiosity here. And she said, why are we trying to recreate the exact same model in a car when it's actually a fundamentally different experience? Right. And so she questioned the status quo, another of those kind of core concepts of being a change maker, questioning the way things are done. She said, no, let's rethink the entire model from the start. And so what she came up with, she realized that the power of a circuit, of a transistor, was just becoming powerful enough that it could store a tiny, tiny bit of data, enough to store 7, 8, 9, 10 phone numbers, digits. And so what she realized is that instead of sending them off as they went, it could store just enough of the digits so that way you dial the number, and then only once you've got the 7, 8, 10, however many numbers you need, then it sends it off to the radio tower. And when it does, then it connects the call. Right? It sounds like this simple little insight, but she was on a team which was only seeing things one way. She was curious enough to say, well, I wonder if there's another path. I wonder if we need not recreate the way things exactly are. And so that's one of the things that curiosity enables us to do, is when we go in with open eyes, we can start seeing things in a brand new way. I mentioned that I'm a new dad, so I've got a 2-year-old at home. And what a wonderful way. If you are ever struggling to sort of be curious, spend some time with a toddler. You can babysit mine if you want, but besides that, the way he sees the world and things are brand new, and the way he's making new connections among things, it's a wonderfully human trait. And unfortunately, it's something that I think gets beaten out of us, especially by the way the traditional schooling systems work and jobs and so on. But I think we are naturally curious. And so one of the most effective things we can do as change makers is to tap into our innate curiosity.
Yeah, but I have my second youngest grandchild is 2. She just left here before our show. She was with me, and she's the joy of my life to spend time with, because she wakes up things in me all the time, and it can see that genuine curiosity about everything, and it's just wonderful. It's joy, pure joy. And we know that between 0 and 4, we learn more than we do if we live 100 years for the next 96 years. And that's partially due to brainwave function and how it works, but also this curiosity. And we're so busy, it's something you've brought as a theme here. We're so busy protecting the status quo that you can't protect the status quo and be curious. You're either in one mode or in the other. And so you have to be willing to challenge the status quo if you're going to be curious. And if you're not going to be curious, you're going to protect the status quo. So I think that that's a really important question you brought forward for us, which is, in this problem I'm trying to solve, am I willing to be curious, therefore challenge the status quo, or am I protecting the status quo because if you're going to protect the status quo, you can't be a change maker, right? So that I love that you brought that forward. We're going to get into a lot of that. We want to get into this micro leadership. We're going to get into how to question the status quo in a very sort of practical way as we move forward. In the second half, we're going to talk about, I want to really talk about the importance of failure. I mean, it's talked a lot about, but I don't know if everybody gets it, and what it really means in the context of being a change maker. We're going to do all that in part 2 with you, Alex. So before we do that, and we come to the end of part 1, please tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out more about you and all the wonderful resources that you have available.
Oh, terrific. So if you want to check out the book called Becoming a Changemaker, available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you're inspired to find out what your greatest strength as a changemaker is, you can take something called the Changemaker Index, and that's at changemakerbook.com/index. And then otherwise, I love connecting with leaders and change makers. And so LinkedIn is the best place. I'm super responsive, so feel free to reach out and connect there. Would love to hear from you.
That would be awesome. Like I said, we will definitely post all of the links to the places that Alex mentioned and a couple more inside of the show notes, so you can find more about Alex and all of his fabulous resources. So we're going to be back in just one click with our special guest, Alex Budak, and we're going to be talking about Becoming a Changemaker Part 2 and what you can actually practically do to get out of your own way, to stay curious and make those changes that you want to see in the world. We're going to be back in just one click. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about how you can become the change maker. See you in one click.